The true crime case of the vampire of the Carpathian Mountains. This story is non-fictional, containing the accounts of a true series of events that transpired in the late 1960s. All names and place names are genuine and true to the facts of the case. Due to the graphic nature of these accounts, reader discretion is advised. The story begins in the mountains of Romania, a village called Almavi. Almavi has a population of only 290 people, with agriculture being the main way of life and source of income for most people of the population. Due to the strong influence of agriculture, the most common means of transport, even for today, is the horse cart. Radu Popescu was born in 1936 and grew up on one of the many farms in the village. When his father died in 1957, he would take over the farm at the age of 21 by himself. It was in May 1968 that the events of this story would begin to unfold. Events which began on a warm, early summer evening. Radu had completed his chores for the day, feeding the animals, tending to his crops, and conducting maintenance on the farm. At around 10 p.m., he said he went to sleep, with everything in perfect order. Radu woke at around 2 a.m. to the sound of his sheep crying outside in distress. With the presence of wolves and bears in this region of the Romanian Carpathian Mountains, Radu feared the worst. He took his rifle from his bedside and set out from the farmhouse into the dark outdoors. He cautiously headed towards the sheep barn, preparing himself for an encounter with a wild, predatory animal. When he entered the barn, there was no animal, and no sheep either. Radu was shocked to find all 12 of his sheep lying motionless on the floor, the moon illuminating the blood splatters on their white coats. He immediately began to search for signs of an animal, but it seemed as if it had fled by then. Radu, however, claims to have then spotted footprints on the ground, footprints of a man. At 6 a.m. the same morning, after no sleep, Radu would file a complaint at the local police in Almavi, with claims that it was a vampire that had killed his sheep. Radu's official report can still be found online, with its original Romanian being translated to English kindly by user Estacion33. The report reads as follows. They were all dead. For them to die in such a short time, it must not have been more than 5 or 6 minutes. It was the way I found them. Look for yourself. They've all been bitten by human teeth marks, not a wolf, not a bear. Their blood drained. I know this sounds ridiculous. Our mothers told us legends of vampires to scare us, of Vlad Tepes. This is real. I promise. Radu's claims were met with a mixture of belief and doubt from the local police and fellow villagers. Vampires play a huge role in Romanian folklore, with Radu even referring Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, whom Bram Stoker based his character Dracula on. Many Romanians, even today, especially in the more rural, mountainous areas, believe in the existence of vampires. However, many will also believe them to be a story made up by mothers to warn their children from straying into the woods. A few days later, on the 18th of May 1968, a neighbor of Radu's would report a similar incident. The unnamed farmer claimed 2 of his goats died in a similar way to Radu's sheep, with a single bite mark and a drainage of blood. The farmer also allegedly claimed to have seen a man running off into the woods, up one of the many engulfing mountains, but this information could not be verified. By this point, Radu and his few supportive neighbors and friends had seemingly had enough of sleeping in fear. On the 20th of May, Radu and 3 other men decided to stay up in their barns with the animals. They each were armed with a rifle and agreed to shoot on sight if any intruders came in. It was around 3:45 when a shot could be heard from one of the men's barns, the barn of Bogdan Dumitru. Radu and the 2 other men rushed over to find Bogdan hurriedly running out of the barn. He shouted at them that he had missed his shot and that the killer was fleeing into the forest up the mountain. Radu and the 2 other men stopped Bogdan from pursuing him, reminding him of the other dangers the woods held at nighttime. He agreed, and the men made plan to set out there tomorrow. At 8 a.m. on the 21st of May, 1968, 7 men from the village of Almavi would set off into the forest up the mountain. This included Radu, Bogdan, and Andrei Balan, the local police officer, as well as 4 others who are unnamed. The men set off with the goal of deciding who or what was responsible for the deaths of the numerous livestock. However, only an hour into their journey, the stakes were raised drastically. Journeying up from the mountain through the forest, Andrei Balan spotted something tucked into a bush. Upon further inspection, he realized it was the corpse of a young man, approximately 30 years old, with black hair and a beard. The man had 2 bite marks. The first, seemingly unsuccessful bite was on his lower back, with a second, deeper bite on his neck. The man's still drying blood suggested that this was a recent murder of that same night, and the men theorized that the creature had become hungry when Bogdan had scared it from his livestock. They were unsure if this was the first person to be killed by it, but it only added to their insistence in finding the beast. They agreed that Andrei and 2 others would take the body back to the village in hopes of identifying the man, and then into the local city to file a report of the murder. The rest would continue their journey. Radu, Bogdan, and the other men continued walking for a few hours. It was around 7 p.m., a long way up the mountain, in an even more isolated location than their own village. They found a small settlement. Bogdan later described the settlement as being absolutely tiny. Their huts were so small, maybe about 15 buildings. They had hay for roofs, and they were not well built. They had no animals, either. Some dogs were roaming, but that was about it. The men became even more unsettled when they met the sparse population of the settlement. They described the people as all having some kind of facial deformity, missing an eye or a disfigured limb. They also often had a severe underbite and limited or no teeth. What the men had stumbled upon was the Orsova region of the Carpathian Mountains. This region was home to a number of incredibly isolated, tiny settlements that had been there for hundreds of years. Due to the size of the settlements and their isolation, inbreeding was prevalent amongst the people, resulting in their unusual appearances. When the group of men began to question the villagers, they initially found it hard to communicate with them, as their literacy levels were low. When they finally managed to ask if they knew anything of a vampire, the people of the settlement all managed to agree on one name: Ionut. No last name could ever be found for Ionut, but his story would soon begin to unfold. The men demanded to see Ionut immediately, but the settlement people explained that they had not seen him for a few weeks, that he was a vampire, and had disappeared after killing and drinking the blood of a local dog. The settlement people told the men how Ionut was born to a line of vampires. They had fangs and would only appear at night, and that when they became old enough, they would drink the blood of animals or people. They said that Ionut's bloodline had been vampires for hundreds of years, as long as they'd been there. and that they'd had to learn to live with them. When the men asked the settlement people how they managed to live with the vampire, they explained how Yonut and his forefathers all shared the same aversion to mirrors. All of the houses in the village had an abundance of mirrors throughout them, as well as candles that were to be lit at night. They explained to the men that this prevented the vampires from entering their homes. Upon hearing all of this information, the men were all shocked. Radu and Bogdan later admitted they even doubted themselves what the inbred villagers were saying. That the vampire they spoke of sounded so cliché it was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. Until that night, when the men finally got sight of Yonut. After hunkering down in the settlement for the night, the four men decided to take turns to keep watch around the small fireplace they had made in the center. Around 1 a.m. that night, with Radu watching over the others, he caught sight of Yonut. A young man, skinny, no older than 20, just on the edge of the tree line. Radu struggled to make it out at first, but it seemed he was gnawing on the head of a rat. Yonut had long fangs and red marks all over his skin. His nose was basically non-existent, 2 holes in the center of his face acting as nostrils. He didn't have a head of hair, but tufts of black hair. After getting over the initial shock of the appearance of Yonut, Radu raised his rifle and fired. He struck Yonut in the chest, killing him instantly. When the men inspected the body, they found blood around his mouth, and around his neck was a crucifix. The crucifix later confirmed to be that of the man that had been killed and had his blood drained in the woods. Yonut was the vampire they'd been looking for. It wasn't until many years later, after his death, that more information on Yonut would present the full picture of what had happened, what had caused him to become the vampire that the men from the village went to hunt. Yonut was born in the early 1950s, placing him to be in his late teens at the time of the killings. Yonut was born in the settlement and, like most of the others, was the product of generations of inbreeding. This gave Yonut a frail figure and an overbite, his teeth protruding over his bottom lip. It also gave him a rare genetic blood disorder named porphyria. Porphyria is a blood disease that occurs when porphyrins affect the nervous system. Interestingly, porphyria is now also known as the vampire's disease. This is because sufferers have an extreme sensitivity to sunlight, which leads to facial disfigurement and blackened skin. This is why sufferers tend to only go out at night. This also leads to a general avoidance of mirrors, as when the condition progresses and their appearance becomes more horrifying, sufferers tend to, understandably, want to avoid seeing their image. Aggressive forms of the disease can also attack the gums and cause them to recede, causing the teeth to be exposed entirely, as if they were fangs. Furthermore, the defect in their red blood cells can cause a craving for blood in order to replace their own. Yonut and his family were not vampires. They had all been sufferers of a rare genetic blood disorder, one that had been passed down for generations, with the inbreeding simply worsening the symptoms of this disorder. Obviously, this information didn't become clear until more research was done on the disorder in the 1990s, when a Romanian medical student who had heard about Yonut's case as a child put 2 and 2 together. Until then, Yonut was simply known as the vampire of the Carpathian Mountains, stalking the night, using his long, sharp fangs to pierce the necks and drink the blood of anyone unfortunate enough to cross him. It's uncertain whether the man in the woods was the only human Yonut ever killed, or if there was a chance the man was already dead when he found him, and no one will ever know. Jonut was described to actually be somewhat of a religious man. Some of the settlement dwellers described how most evenings, as a boy, he'd be found praying contently by himself. Perhaps praying to be normal. As far as the men of the village were concerned, however, the vampire had been slain, and they could return to Almaviv as heroes. Many thought that this was the end of the story, until the 13th of September 1988, with Radu Popescu, having contracted tuberculosis, lying on his deathbed with his wife and only son by his side. He let them know how much he loved them, before revealing there was something he had to say. He hadn't said it sooner, as he didn't want to panic anybody in the village. But as he was leaving the mountain settlement on the 21st of May, 1968, 20 years prior, one of the settlement women had pulled him in close to tell him something. She said that there was a girl in the settlement, Jonut's half-sister. She was the only one Jonut was ever seen spending time with as a child, noting that in her appearance she was relatively normal. A year prior to the events unfolding, she had become pregnant with Jonut's child. Of the siblings, she became the first to leave the settlement to give birth, traveling to a town some 18 kilometers away. Radu described how the woman then pulled him in close. She gave birth to the children of Jonut, triplets, 3 boys. 3 boys that will have the vampire curse. 3 boys that will seek revenge when they come of age. Radu died on the 14th of September, with his wife and son passing his final message on to the villagers of Almaviv. The final reported incident occurred in the village of Zlagna, only 45 kilometers away from Almaviv. The report was by a man named Bogdan Guskov in October 1988. Guskov was a farmer as well, describing how he awoke one night to hear his sheep crying. When he went to investigate, all of them were dead, drained of blood by a single bite mark to the neck. Interestingly, when he filed a report with the local police, he mentioned a detail that would haunt Bogdan Dimitris, Andrei, and the rest of the villagers in Almaviv who had witnessed the events some 20 years prior for the rest of their lives. Guskov claimed it was not a bear or a wolf that had committed this heinous crime, that it was a man. That he found footprints heading into the nearby woods. 3 identical pairs of human footprints. Reader's note: no children of Jonut could ever be found nor identified. This information is unconfirmed. But a recent survey in 2016 found that over 70% of people in the region believe in vampires, with 24% of respondents stating that they had seen one.